Hi everybody, Christian here, Disc Golf Institute. I'm gonna go through the first part, the muscle function part, and the muscle function part is actually divided into several pieces. One of the main functions within muscle function is the muscles' capability to decelerate, lengthen and shorten. So the muscles really don't know what you are doing. Their only job is to prevent you from falling, so a lot of training and a lot of activity that we are training for is actually to learn how to train the muscle to prevent you from fall and to explode out from that. So with that knowledge, I'm gonna teach you how the muscles are function in disc golf, and I'm gonna also educate you in how you can train the muscle function in its decelerating phase and its acceleration phase. And actually the first one is more important than the second one, because all of the muscles can really shorten, but it's the lengthen part that is the difficult part. So to explode on a muscle from a lengthening part of the muscles to a shortening one is the most critical task that we have in the sport of disc golf. So the muscle has to be able to lengthen and shortening, and it's gonna do that in all three planes. So as I mentioned in the introduction, all the muscles need to work in the sagittal plane, it's front and back, and in the frontal plane, the side to side, and in the rotational plane as well. So that's really important when we are training for disc golf. One of the reasons is also that we're training for a certain way is that we have to get away from the anatomical model that we were taught in school. So a lot of the muscles, almost every muscle out there, is actually having the opposite function than it says in the anatomy books. And the reason for that is because we have gravity, momentum, and the reaction force from the ground reaction force. So whatever we have been taught in school, it really is the opposite in sports. So let's say that we are taking the calves, for example, and the gastroc. We all been taught in the school that it's really plantar flexing the foot, it's pushing the foot down like this, and it's inverting the heel. That's what we have been taught, in a concentric manner. But that's only what happens when you are laying down. So as soon as you're standing up and playing disc golf, for example, it actually does exactly the opposite. It decelerates the dorsiflexion, the flexing of the foot, not plantar flexing, the flexing of the foot, and the eversion of the heel. It's when the heel going out. So that was only a muscular example. I will give you more of those, and that is so very obvious for us when we are looking at the EMG studies and see how the muscles are firing right in the opposite function of the anatomic book function. And it's what's differentiate from good disc golf training from a gym training or a machine, or a more isolated structural based phase or approach on the training. And that's the wrong thing to do it. That's also why we shouldn't be doing a certain amount of exercises, let's say crunches or the plank. Those are actually also based in a prone or a supine position, lying down, not in throwing discs, where we need to separate the pelvis here from the trunk up here and work with the muscle function in a better manner. Hi everybody, Christian here. Again, this is the part in muscle function we're gonna talk about deceleration and acceleration of muscle function. And as I mentioned before, it's all of the muscles just know how to prevent you from falling out on the disc golf course. And it's very critical for us in the disc golf shot to really control the decelerating phase and providing that to acceleration phase as well. So the phase where the muscle actually is lengthening against the resistance is also a contraction phase, which means that we can name it eccentric phase. So this is one of the most critical points in disc golf muscle function to understand, that a muscle is actually created because of its ability to resist a motion. So that phase we're gonna call the eccentric phase. The most obvious example I can give you is a regular squat. So when you are squatting down, you have these big muscles here on the front side of the legs called quadriceps, and the anatomy says in the book that it's extending the knees. But in real function, it really controls the opposite function. So it controls flexion, and the better it controls flexion, the better it's also creating the extension in the knee. This actually means that every sports that involve in knee flexion should be training on the decelerating phase almost only, because it's very easy for the muscle to contract after that. So it's just like a rubber band, okay? So this principle we're gonna use in disc golf in different planes as well. We are still at the muscle function part of this principle and strategies course, the why behind the what. And now we're going to talk about local and global movements. And what I mean by that is that a muscle, when it's laying down in the anatomy books, says one thing, laying down, prone or supine, but in standing and in motion, it actually have the opposite function. For example, we can have, for example, hamstrings. The hamstrings is the back side of the thigh, and it's actually attaching up here at the pelvis, going all the way down to tibia, which is the bone below the thigh bone. And in the anatomy books, it says that it's a knee flexor and a hip extensor. And that's only what the muscle does, you know, with a person laying down, or you know, when you have measured its anatomy function, which is basically on dead persons. But in function, it's a whole different ball game. As you can see, the muscle, the hamstrings, are going from the pelvis here, crossing down here, actually crossing the hip joint without attaching to it, into over the knee joint and into the lower leg, which means that it could function over several joints at the same time. So it has a lot of directions and functions at the same time. So a muscle can function locally when you're just looking at the joints it crossed, but it also can function globally. And the example in hamstrings is pretty easy to understand. It's a big muscle group, and when it's attached to the pelvis, and the pelvis is basically the lower back, because the higher part of the pelvis here is the lower back. So the hamstrings has a dramatically effect on the lower back. The same thing is for the foot and ankle. It attaches to this bone here, which basically is the foot, because it hooks down to the calcaneus, the heel bone here, and several bone as well, so it affects dramatically the function of the foot. So you can say that hamstrings have a dramatically effect, you know, all the way from the foot all the way up to the spine, and obviously the shoulder, because the spine goes over to the shoulder later on, and etc, etc. So it's a chain reaction, and this is actually one of the cool things with muscles, that it could function in so many different ways. That's one thing. The other thing is that it could also be concentric in one plane and eccentric in another plane at the same time. So what I mean by that is, let's say in a disc golf shot, let's say that we are going back in the backswing here, then you can see that my hip here is internally rotating, and because my hand is going faster than the pelvis is doing, we have an internally rotated hip here. This means that hamstrings and the pelvis is also internally rotating and decelerating that motion. At the same time, the pelvis, which is here, is dropping forward in the backswing. You can't really see that, but you can feel it when you're feeling on the pelvis. It's dropping forward, and because of the attachments of the hamstrings up here, it really hooks onto the pelvis and goes with it. So it both internally rotates and anteriorly, you know, tilting forward at the same time. So this is two function, but at the same time, at this occurs, you might have noticed that I am flexing at the knee, which is actually shortening the hamstrings down there. So it's lengthening up here, but it's shortening down here at the same time, which means that it's eccentric, it's decelerating up at the pelvis and through the hip, but it's actually are contracting at the knee joint. So I will actually go through this muscle by muscle in each part of the biomechanical part later on, but I need you to understand the importance of these functions in disc golf, because it's critical when we're designing your training program later on.